Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to Stuart Style, Textiles from the Gloucester. My name is Professor Claire Jowitt. I'm Project Director for UEA's Gloucester project, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to welcome you to our final event in our 2023 series of talks, The Stories of the Gloucester Shipwreck, Norfolk's Mary Rose. We've got three fantastic speakers coming up, but before that, a couple of important housekeeping points. Though actually this one's quite important. There will be a free drinks reception in the rotunda following the event. After our three speakers, there will be an audience Q&A, and at around 7 o'clock, and that will last about 30 minutes. I extend a particularly warm welcome to our online viewers. Those attending the live stream, please place your questions in the YouTube chat. And everybody here, whether you're online or in present, and I hope you'll do this, can watch back the live stream at your convenience. You can watch this over and over again on the UEA Public Engagement Events YouTube channel. So, the Stories of the Gloucester series complement the current exhibition on here at Norwich Castle. Gloucester, the last voyage of the Gloucester, Norfolk's Royal Shipwreck 1682. If you haven't seen it yet, and we believe more than 40,000 people have already seen it, it's on for another 2 months, on until the 10th of September. This is particularly for the our online audience. Please come to Norwich over the summer. It's absolutely fantastic here. This is the last event in our series, and I want to say some thanks. First, to the University of East Anglia's Humanities Events team, Molly Taylor and Sophie Scott in particular, who've supported the organisation of the series with such care and such skill. This, I believe, is Molly's last event for UEA, so we really owe her a huge debt for the 9 years of supporting us. To Norfolk Museum Service here at the castle, particularly Sophie Cabot, who has just been fantastic, and all the team have been fantastic in hosting us. To the Arts and Humanities Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sarah Barrow, and Associate Dean Research, Professor Lee Jarvis, who paid for the series, and the drinks reception for those attending that people will enjoy at 7:30. To Julian and Lincoln Barnwell, who are in our front row here, and Julian's son Charles, Julian and Lincoln here for finding the wreck, and for supporting the series tonight. And of course to you, our audience. I hope that you have enjoyed our series of expert talks on drinking culture at the time of the wreck, on naval history, and on shipwreck and art and literature, and that they have given you a sense of the richness and interest of both the life of the Gloucester and of the times in which the ship operated. Today's talk is different again, and we're going to get up close and personal with an important aspect of this wreck, the rescued textiles and clothes. And at UEA, we are collecting feedback on the event tonight and on the series. So please, if you have time and an inclination at the end of the event today, please do give us some feedback on we'd love to know what you think. We also have another UEA colleague here, Helen Fitzhugh, who is working for Partnerships for East Coast Communities, a research project at UEA. And we are really interested in improving the lives of coastal communities through that research project. And Helen has some questionnaires that, again, if you have the time and inclination, she would love to know your thoughts about how we can help people take pride in coastal communities, of which the Gloucester, I hope, is a good exemplar. Additionally, if you're interested in knowing more about the future of the Gloucester, including about plans to develop a new museum, most likely in Great Yarmouth, then please do come and talk either to me or to Julian and Lincoln after the event, and we'd love to tell you more about those plans and about the Gloucester 1682 Charitable Trust, which is chaired by General Lord Richard Dannett, and downstairs there are leaflets about that. So again, you can find out more there. Back to tonight. Due to the remarkable nature of the textiles recovered from the wreck site, I am hugely excited to chair, it's such a privilege, this evening's event on Stuart style, textiles from the Gloucester. As one of the four curators of the exhibition, it's been a real privilege to work with such extraordinary items and to think about and speculate about the lives of their 17th century owners. We've had the most amazing conversations. Who owned them? What were their lives like? One of the points we were particularly keen to emphasise in our exhibition is that the wreck and loss of the Gloucester early in the morning of 6th May 1682 catastrophically changed many, many lives. Intimate objects, such as clothes and shoes worn on the body, speak very powerfully, perhaps uniquely powerfully, to the human stories of the men and probably small number of women on board the Gloucester on that fateful morning. What can the designs and styles of the items tell us about their choices, perhaps even about their thoughts and feelings of those men and women? We know the ship in May 1682 was packed to the gunwales with people. With the crew, the ship is rated to carry over 200 men, with elite passengers, including James, Duke of York, and heir presumptive to the English and Scottish thrones. Some accounts suggest up to 80 nobles accompanied him, plus all their servants. And we know, because James tells us so, that many of his underservants died in the wreck. We also know that the ship was packed with luggage. James didn't travel light, and it literally took hours to transfer the luggage from the Duke's royal yacht to the Gloucester before it could set sail. And one of the most significant archaeological finds of this century are the two luggage chests and their contents, which the finders Julian and Lincoln Barnwell rescued in 2015 and 16. And in chest A, they discovered a bundle of cloth, apparently nondescript, which was in fact an amazing collection of clothes and other personal items. So exciting. So without further ado, I am immensely indebted to our expert speakers. Tonight, Maria Hayward from Southampton University, and then historical costumier Ninya Mikhalia, and Norfolk Museum Service Curator Ruth Battersby Tooke, who have generously agreed to share their expertise on Stuart style with us. I simply can't wait to hear what they're going to say, which is good because I won't have to wait much longer. So I'm going to introduce Maria now. The title of her talk, The Politics of Restoration Fashion, and Maria is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Southampton, where she's currently head of department. Her research interests focus on clothing, textiles, and material culture in the 16th and 17th century, and especially at the Tudor and Stuart courts. Her most recent book is Stuart Style, Monarchy, Dress, and the Scottish Male Elite, published by Yale in 2020, and it was winner of History Book of the Year in Scotland's National Book Awards in 2021. And it is the most fantastic book. So if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to get it. But Maria, please.
Thank you, Claire, for that very kind introduction. And I would also like to thank the University of East Anglia and all of Claire's team for the invitation to talk this evening. Sorry, it's not supposed to do that, is it? The Restoration was a very unusual time in the history of the British Isles. After the Civil War, the execution of the king, the abolition of the monarchy, and the interregnum, things changed once more in the spring of 1660. Charles II, who we can see here, celebrated the prospect of the restoration of the monarchy and his return home after 15 years in exile at the Moritz House at The Hague in the Dutch Republic on the 22nd of May. We can see him here dressed in the fashionable style of the day, a short doublet and petticoat breeches, and he is dancing the courante, one of the French court dancers, with his sister, Mary, Princess of Orange. His love of good company would result in him being known as the Merry Monarch, and the author Daniel Defoe described his reign as long, lazy, and lascivious. However, his reign has also been associated with the emergence of the political party in the form of the Whigs and the Tories, two groups of politicians who had distinctly differing views on foreign policy, trade, religion, and domestic politics. So this talk will briefly explore why clothing in the Restoration period was not a frivolous matter. And it is divided into two parts. The first looks at the big picture and puts the clothes that we will see in the coming slides into their wider political context. And the second will then briefly consider James, Duke of York, and his second wife, Mary of Modena, looking specifically at some of the aspects of Restoration politics and the clothing of the 1670s and 1680s. To start, it is important to consider what Restoration fashion was like. And a good way to do this is to look at some surviving examples. And here we can see the doublet and petticoat breeches that are associated with the Verney family from Claydon. So in other words, this is an actual textile version of what we saw in that portrait a minute ago. Perhaps not surprisingly, many contemporaries were underwhelmed by this style for men. They saw it as effeminate, especially as those full breeches echoed the shapes of women's petticoats. And they also were unenthused by the serious quantity of silk ribbon that you can see decorating them. Some of these suits might include up to 200 yards of ribbon to create that effect. To put this into context, I'm showing you an example of female fashions from the early 1660s. This is a silver tissue gown which is trimmed in parchment lace. Examples like this, as we can see, are fascinating because they required a range of fabrics, including the outer fabrics, so the silver tissue, linings and interlinings that you can't see when you see them from the outside, but you can get a glimpse of from the picture on the right. These were then put in tandem with the skill of the maker to ensure a good fit. They were finished with trimmings and then combined with accessories, including headwear, gloves, shoes, jewellery, makeup, and perfume to complete the ensemble. So these are the fashions for men and women in the 1660s. If we move forward several decades to the 1690s, I would like to introduce you to Lord Clapham. He is a clothed doll, and he is dressed in the height of male fashion for the 1690s. We can see quite a distinct change in terms of the garments and also the cut and fit. This style was regarded as much more suitable for good, masculine English men. It consisted of wool, a wool coat, worn over a cloth of silver waistcoat and breeches. Now, current thinking suggests that Lord Clapham and his wife, who we will meet in a minute, belonged to the Cockerell family, who were related by marriage to Samuel Pepys, the famous Restoration diarist. And you can see him in the different layers. So we have him in his shirt on the right, then with his waistcoat and breeches, and then finally with the coat to complete the ensemble. And this is his wife, Lady Clapham, who we can see now elegantly attired in a silk mantua and petticoat, teamed with a cap, and then underpinned by a pair of bodies worn over a chemise with a hanging pocket, and then her stockings that were secured with ribbon garters. the other thing that these dolls both come with are clothes for relaxation. And for those that could afford it, they had clothes for different times of day and different types of activity. And so here we can see them in their nightgowns. This was the garment par excellence for relaxing. And as we can see, for men and women, they were similar in shape and construction. And they were the ideal vehicle to show off highly patterned and very expensive fabrics, such as this Chinese silk. So in other words, clothing not only would demonstrate your ability to engage with and afford fashionable dress, but it also very much marked your place in society. And the more clothes you had, again, demonstrated, your access to the different spheres of life. Now, after the Restoration, Charles II was able to invest in his wardrobe. And so it is not surprising that his clothes were closely scrutinised and attracted much comment. Now, one observer was Samuel Pepys, who I've mentioned already. He was an inveterate gatherer of gossip, and he was really interested in what the king was wearing to get a guidance on how he might shape his own wardrobe. Not that he would ever be quite in the same style as the king, but he took the king as the benchmark of what he should wear. Now, some of the other observers of the king's wardrobe were those members of parliament that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, they, of course, voted the king the money to run his household and purchase that expensive wardrobe. Now, when Charles addressed Parliament on the 29th of August 1660, he stated, "I am not richer, that is, I have not so much money in my purse as when I came to you." Now, this is where when he arrived, having been in exile for a long period of time, he was very short of money. And he is complaining that Parliament is still keeping him short of money. They granted him £1,200,000 per annum, but he invariably ran at quite a substantial deficit. Now, part of that can be put down to the amount he spent on his clothing. It was a relatively modest £7,000 on average per year, but this gives you a sense that clothes were an important investment for any individual, and the king was no exception. Now, if we take this one step further, people, as I mentioned, looked at the king's clothes. And so in the autumn of 1660, Charles openly decided he was going to change the fashion. He asserted that he was going to create a new style, which was known as the vest. Now, ultimately, the coat, the vest, and the breeches, which we see develop during the course of his reign, will become what we would now think of as the modern men's three-piece suit. But for Charles, the introduction of the vest was important because it allowed him to assert his sense of Englishness by rejecting French fashion. And what he said was that he was not only rejecting French style, but he was also rejecting French fabrics, in particular French silk, and he was encouraging his citizens to wear English wool. And we see then Pepys describing the impact of this. Now, not surprisingly, this rejection of French fashion does not last long. Now, many of the king's critics say that this is, of course, because he was a lazy and indolent ruler. But in many ways, he'd made his point. He wanted to just let Louis, his cousin, know that he could change the fashion if he wanted, and he wasn't tied to French coattails. Now, initially, as just here, I've explored the importance of France and French fashion and how the king might choose to engage with it at some points and reject it as others when it suited him to do so in terms of his specific foreign policy at the time. But there are other ways in which clothing was important and associated with national identity. So Charles II was crowned as King of England on the 23rd of April, 1661. However, he was more than the king or royal representative of one nation. He ruled over the 3 Stuart kingdoms of England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland. So one of the important questions for the king was, how would he create a style that embodied all of the individuals who lived under his domain? And it's interesting that at various points he promotes different aspects of that identity. So here we can see him during the Civil War. He's 12 years old at this point, and for his father's cause he is very much promoting himself and being promoted by his father as Prince of Wales. Now here you wouldn't necessarily know that from what he's wearing, but throughout the rest of his life he observed St. David's Day, and once we get into the Restoration period, his royal embroiderer Edmund Harrison would produce little embroidered leeks decorated with pearls and gold thread for the king, queen, and all of the other members of the royal family. Now here we can see Charles engaging with his Scottish subjects, and as you can see, not necessarily that well. One of the issues for Charles was, of course, that he needed a crown, and his Scottish subjects saw the opportunity to see that they would get something in return. So he was crowned in Scotland, and in return he gave them concessions in relation to religion, and what he would do for religion in Scotland in particular, but also the whole of the British Isles after he recovered his other Stuart kingdoms. But here we can see him very much in the traditional robes of the monarch. And his coronation in Scotland was important because it gave him legitimacy during his long period of exile. Now, after his restoration, Charles was keen to continue that association with Scotland. Here we can see a portrait of John Lacey, one of the leading actors of the day, dressed in the clothes of 3 of his most famous parts. And the one I want to focus on here is that of Sawney the Scot. We can see him dressed with his trews and with his plaid. And that highlights that for Scots, they had the option to wear traditional dress, but they could also embrace fashionable dress as well. And as such, here we can see then that they could use clothing to look as though they belonged within the Stuart world, or they could very much use it to associate their importance and indeed make the case to remind the king that Scotland was the oldest and most important of his 3 Stuart kingdoms. But not all Scots chose to dress in that style. This is the Duke of Lauderdale, one of the leading politicians in Charles's government, both in England and also in Scotland, and we can see him very much engaged and embracing that style that Charles was promoting at court. And thirdly, the last example of how clothing could be used to promote national identity is represented here by Charles's wife, Catherine of Braganza. Now, Catherine was from Portugal, and this was regarded by Charles's subjects both as a good and a problematic thing. On the positive side, she brought a great amount of wealth, and in particular trading connections through her dowry on the point of her marriage. However, to English eyes, when they saw her either for real, dressed as she appears on the left, or in many prints, they would have found her clothing very unusual. And indeed, for those that were familiar with what she's wearing, so we see the Garde du Infanta, that they would have seen this as very much a Spanish court style. Now, this, of course, then would have reminded them also of her Catholicism, which is a problematic area. And as a consequence, we can see that, not surprisingly, Catherine rapidly changes her style from one that makes her look like an outsider to one that makes her look like she belonged at court. Now, one of the things that is interesting about the clothes that we have considered so far, both the extant examples and also those in portraits, are the fabrics that they are made from. Contemporaries looked at wool fabrics like this and the embroidery or the silks that we've seen elsewhere, and it provoked a range of debates. One of these was to do with luxury and the problems that this might cause. Another were the dangers of fashion, but a third was the fact that clothing ought to be tied to domestic goods, and good, loyal citizens of the Stuarts should wear fabrics produced within the Stuart countries. And this, of course, is another reason why we see a lot of wool appearing in the male wardrobe, in particular for the elite and across the social order for both men and women. As a consequence, we regularly see the king being petitioned to do more to help promote English trade. So, for instance, in 1673 and 1675, the Weavers' Company petitioned the king, who responded by issuing a proclamation saying that he would now only wear English manufacture with the exception of linen and calico. So in that sense, textiles and clothing then expressed a strong sense of national identity, but very closely related to trade. They also were important in terms of promoting ideas of tradition and legitimacy, both things that were very important for Charles after his restoration. So before Charles's English coronation, Sir Edward Hyde noted that the king had directed the records and old formularies should be examined, and all the forms accustomed to be used, that they might add lustre and splendour to the solemnity. Now, we know that Pepys was present, and he was deeply impressed by the display of the clothing and the textiles and the richness. Now, while we can't see what Pepys saw, if we look at this portrait, we do get a sense of the way in which the king embraced many aspects of tradition to demonstrate that his coronation in England was just the seamless following on from that of his father, and just a casual and a complete ignoring of what had gone on in between. Now, this portrait is thought to represent the king in the 1670s. So in that sense, it shows you the political situation then means that it is important for him to be reminding his subjects of their loyalty to him, the oaths that they took at their coronation. And it is paired here with the new regalia that was made for him to legitimise his rule. This gives you a close-up of one of the suits of the type that you can see the king wearing. This is a suit that was associated with the Order of the Garter. It was made of cloth of silver tissue, and it was made for Charles Stuart, the husband of Frances Stuart. So in other words, we can see the fashionable suit being teamed with a fabric that had really dropped out of mainstream fashion, being used to revive the Order of the Garter, which was one of the most important political orders. And Charles used it very effectively to bind individuals to him. So far, I've highlighted individuals at the top of the elite, but it's worth stressing that Charles II was one of the few English monarchs who genuinely experienced financial difficulty. He knew what it was to be short of clothes and to lack the right clothes for a particular occasion. In particular, when he was on the run after the Battle of Worcester, he adopted disguise. As you can see, here he is being recorded by Fuller, and we can see him very much in the clothing of the popular people. This was a style that then influenced his fashionable choices, and as such it also then trickled down the social order. So we can see Viner, the man who made the regalia for Charles, here relaxing at home, engaging in a variety of those fashionable styles that we saw. Someone a little further down the social order is Pepys. He rented his nightgown in order to look suitably elegant for his portrait. But he too was very aware of the nuances of fashionable clothing, and at one point commented that he could not let his wife go out because she didn't have the suitable gown for that season. So just to move on to look very briefly at James, this is his wedding suit to Mary of Modena. It was a very carefully chosen garment. It is a combination of English wool. It was made for him by an English tailor. And even though the wedding was a very private affair, because his marriage to Mary was highly contentious, we can see him being presented on the one hand as a loyal citizen, a loyal brother, but also heir to the throne. And as Claire alluded to, James's religion was hugely problematic in him being heir to the throne. He had recently converted to Catholicism, and as such, this then caused grave anxiety for what might happen after Charles's death. This is his wife, Mary of Modena, dressed in the height of fashion. Whereas James was not necessarily overly popular, Mary was, in spite of her Catholicism. Here we can see her wearing one of the styles that was very much modelled on male clothing, one which her husband and Pepys found very attractive. Unfortunately, James admired other women apart from his wife wearing it, which caused tension within their marriage. But the last thing that I want to just highlight about Mary is that it was her unexpected conception of a son and the safe delivery of a son that was actually far more important than anything that she might do in terms of leading fashion. Indeed, after the birth of their son, James Francis Edward Stuart, we have the warming pan scandal, the suggestion that someone else must have been the father of the child, couldn't possibly have been James. But the reason why I mention this in this context is that James holds a hearing to bring evidence on both sides to see whether the baby could be legitimate. And here the evidence all hinges on people's observations of Mary's clothed, partially clothed and unclothed body. So in conclusion, this brief paper has explored the ways in which clothing was more than something to keep the wearer warm and dry. It was closely observed and commented upon. Now, this is true of clothing in most periods of history, but the issues associated with Stuart dress and its importance very much was appreciated by the Georgians in all of the sorts of ways that the Stuarts valued clothing. So in this picture, we see George III, Queen Charlotte, and their 6 children. The 2 older boys are dressed in a variant of Stuart style, and it's intentional. It is designed to reinforce that the Hanoverians are the legitimate heirs of the Stuarts, unlike those other Stuarts that are rather inconveniently living in Rome at this point, and for whom many loyal subjects still saw as the kings over the water. So I'd like to thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maria. We now have 2 speakers who are going to work in concert together. Ruth Battersby Tooke and Ninya Mikhalia. So Ruth has worked as the Curator of Costume and Textiles for Norfolk Museum Service for 17 years. So fantastic. In her current role, Ruth has curated several blockbuster exhibitions, including Frayed, Textiles on the Edge, which was shortlisted for the Museums and Heritage Awards in the category of Best Temporary Exhibition, and Nelson and Norfolk, featuring Norfolk Museum Service's largest object, a 9 by 16 metre French tricolour captured by Nelson's squadron in 1800, and we've seen it, and it's extraordinary. It's a brilliant thing. Ninya established her business making reconstructions of historic costumes for museums and heritage in 1994 after studying at the London College of Fashion. Her clients include historic royal palaces, the royal armouries, the National Trust, English heritage, and many, many more. And she's featured in the 6-part BBC television series, A Stitch in Time. She is one half of the Tudor Tailor, a company specialising in reconstructing and publishing material on 16th century dress. And I couldn't be more pleased to welcome them up to speak to you.
Just going to swap over the PowerPoints. Bear with me a moment.
Sorry, I should have helped.
That's all right. Sorry. For 17 years, hopefully, I know how it works. Okay, just get the right buttons. Right, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Claire, for that lovely introduction, and Maria for that brilliant first talk. So the scope of my section of this presentation is object-based research, offering a reading of the textile assemblage within the context of the other artefacts found in chest A, which was the first of 2 chests to be rescued over the summer dive seasons of 2015, that's chest A, and 2016 for chest B. But before I start, I just wanted to make a comment on survival bias and the way that influences how we read a certain period. So as in the Norwich Costume and Textile collections, we have a very small, very precious group of 17th century objects. We have panels of embroidery, beadwork that have been removed. They're exquisitely embroidered, so they've been taken off the work boxes which they were adorning, and also shoes which have been concealed in buildings for good luck, and babies' caps kept for sentimental reasons or for family heirlooms. And their survival into the 21st century is due to one of the following factors: either inherent artistic or material value, luck, or love. But they are divorced from the settings in which they were part. So they were part of a wardrobe, part of the furniture, whereas archaeological assemblages such as the Gloucester textile bundle are quite a different matter. They're frozen in one moment, a snapshot in time, and in this case, of a tragic event. They were not selected for survival, but they are now extremely rare examples of material culture. They have not been unpicked, reused, worn to death. They speak to us now because their active life stopped, and they offer us a glimpse into untouched dress artefacts from a period with very few comparable examples. Although they hold much information about the construction of dress and about the design of fabrics, they actually prompt just as many, if not more, questions than answers that they provide. So one fundamental inquiry, obviously, is the intention of the person that put this bundle in the chest in the first place. And here is where we are applying close object reading along with that very detective and human skill of empathising in order to keeping it within the bounds of historical understanding of the period. So hopefully it's going to go the right way, yes. Okay, so what we're talking about here is we're talking about one bundle packed in the bottom of one chest on this large vessel containing not just the crew, as Claire alluded to in her introduction, but overcrowded with passengers and their baggage. So the Duke of York's household, his retinue, their servants, all crammed into this space. And as Professor Jowitt's recent article in the English Historical Review tells us, this was quite a convoluted process of moving people and goods from London on barges onto royal yachts and then finally onto the frigates themselves. And this took several hours, just that loading from the yachts onto and there was probably considerable amounts of where everything is actually going to go and who's going, although you've decided where people are going to be positioned, their luggage is quite another matter. There is no muster list to give us the numbers of people, but conditions on the Gloucester were so crowded enough for Samuel Pepys, who gets to mention at every single one of these talks, so I'm glad to be able to finish off with this one, to have to move from the Gloucester, deciding it was too overcrowded, to another vessel in the fleet. So as the chests themselves have not been recovered, we don't know if for sure that it belonged to one individual or maybe was actually being used as somewhere for the passengers to stow their belongings during the journey. So here is the bundle. prior to conservation, so it had been kept in fresh water and changed regularly, and this is it just before it's about to be unwrapped and carefully air dried. So until they were exposed by the movement of sound waves on the seabed, these were in anaerobic conditions, hence the amazing preservation of the textiles. So the outer layer of this one is actually one of the 2 silk petticoats, and the one that's in display in the exhibition. And you can just about see, I'm going to use the pointer here, that there is just the tiny heel of a shoe there, and considerable rust staining on the top here, and that's echoed in this X-ray here. You can see the same shape. So this is showing that it's been in contact with metal, which has rusted away and caused some damage to it. So these 2 X-rays were taken just before the unwrapping, and of course the key feature you can see here is the bundle of pins. There are 2 sizes, one slightly longer than the other, and they are bundled together rather than being pinned into anything. And the pins were an essential part of contemporary dress, helping you to keep everything just where it should be, pinned into place, but also obviously a part of a dressmaker's tools and equipment. So by the time I encountered the objects, they were dry and looked like this. So here we have on top the silk hood and the garment which sits in the place of a collar but would have been called a gorget or a whisk. And it looks like these were white or off-white. There's no traces of colour in any of the under the hems or anything like that. So they also have no sign of ever having added decorations to them. So they are this plain. And this illustration is the one we've used in the exhibition, and it's a couple of years after the sinking, but it does show a really great view of women wearing hoods and gorgets from front and behind, so you can see how they look in the round. So the rolled back edge of the hood is most evident on the woman closest to us, and also that flounce around the bottom of the gorget. So Pat Poppy's article recently in the Costume Society Journal details the accessories of Rachel, Countess of Bath, as itemised through her account book, and has mentions there of hoods not only being available to the elite but also to the middle classes off the shelf, and also in silk fabrics too, including taffeta. Although this one we're not sure, but it feels very much lighter weight and perhaps a sarsenet. And it's also noted that gorgets are rarely found in lower class inventories and households. So I'm just showing you some Dutch genre paintings, because you see these silk hoods often in English paintings and engravings from the middle of the century, but actually as you get closer on, and some of the lovely portraits that Maria showed us, they don't really appear so much in fashionable portraiture towards the period of the Gloucester. So these Dutch genre paintings, which show women in domestic settings, slightly less formal dress, do give you a really brilliant sense, especially the Peter de Hoek one there, where you can see how the shape of the hood is created at the back. Okay, so this is the petticoat that we saw around the outside of the bundle, and this is actually the better preserved of the two. The other one is very fragmentary, and then a contrast next to a picture from 1684, just to show that petticoats, the reason that it's elaborately decorative is because actually they would have been on show with the gown over the top being held back, pinned back or tied back in order to show the petticoat beautifully. So the one thing that's notable about the Gloucester petticoat is that it doesn't have a flounce around the bottom. So you can see a thread which is around 8 centimetres up from the hem there, which is still in place. So whether there was an applied decoration that has deteriorated over time more than the silk, it can't really be said at the moment. But the one thing that is puzzling about this is if you're going to unpick something, the one thing you really do is you definitely pull out that thread from it. So this one is causing a little poser as to why there is a thread there, but the flounce or the trim is not remaining. So that beautiful damask, this is a drawing that we commissioned for the exhibition, showing one pattern repeat, and that pattern repeat goes 4 times across the selvage width, and they're designed so that when you stitch them all together, all the selvages to make a petticoat, it looks like a continuous pattern. And I've just put this one next to it. This is the closest I could find in terms of another damask from the Victoria and Albert Museum collections from either France or Italy, 1660 to 1699. So I think we can say that that's definitely similar to something pre-1682 now, which is fantastic. And this looks like it might be a reused piece of fabric that's been used to make this cover, with possibly this being the central piece, and you would expect to see more red going across into the edge there. So what is glaringly obvious immediately from comparing this with the petticoat that we have is that the uniform rich brown colour of the petticoat that came from the Gloucester, without any distinction of different colours within that, whereas I would have expected to see it with colour in there. And we did send 7 samples off to a testing lab in order to try and see if there were any colours that had remained through chemical analysis, but sadly nothing was found biological there apart from tannin. So tannin being presumably coming from the wood that it was in the chest as well, and also the leather too, which has given it this kind of brown colour, and possibly also bathed the whites in that lovely golden colour that we can see. So that's a shame that we can't see that one. So at the very centre of the bundle was a pair of shoes. This is just one on the left-hand side, and the other one is in very fragmentary condition. The upper is in lots of pieces, like the worst jigsaw puzzle you can imagine. And I'm putting here again another Victoria and Albert Museum collection just to show how the fashionable shape would have been when it was actually all together. Now it does show signs of wear on the sole, so again I think it has been used, but the conditions two porters say whether anything else was happening there, in terms of whether it was repairing or whatever, but it doesn't have any of this applied decoration that's on there. There's no other stitching there. Now, aside from those main garments and accessories, there were actually around about 90 other fragments that came out of that textile bundle. And some are parts of garments. So you can see just on the top there, that is a piece of knitting. There are 2 different weights, at least 2 different weights of knitting in terms of gauge and the thickness of it. And that top one is slightly heavier, and with the ribbing, which is just evident there, this could either be the top of a stocking or possibly the cuff of a garment, but the lower one, which is much finer knitting, more the kind of weight of your jersey t-shirts, has also got a woven textile as a lining, and there are parts of hems still evident. So this looks like it may very well have been an upper garment, perhaps a knitted jacket. This piece in the centre here is one of several pieces of a gauzy open weave silk fabric, and this seems to be parts of a scarf. But again, we need to sort of try and get them all out together and see if we can make enough of a match to find that. But that has another hemmed edge on it as well, which is another indicator that it's been fashioned rather than just a bolt of cloth. And that is the other petticoat in the condition that it's in there, just seeing that it is also damask, but a little bit simpler in its design. So tucked into the edge of the bundle was this wooden case with 2 pairs of spectacles, one of which has completely lost its frames now, just leaving the lenses down there. And it has velvet on the inside of the wooden box as well to sort of keep these safe. It would have been an expensive investment to have a pair of spectacles like this, so you want to keep it safe, which is also where we start to get into this feeling of a really human connection with the person that packed this. They're obviously thinking it's a very relatable thing to tuck your glasses case inside this clumpy piece of fabric to keep it safe on the journey, but it did mean that it was not close, they weren't close to hand for the journey itself. It would have been right at the bottom there. So it's important to see this bundle within its context. So this is a list of the artifacts that came out day by day, or dive day, and I've just highlighted those that have a connection to textiles, just to show how prevalent they are within the rest of the material in the actual chest. So there were 4 pairs of men's shoes. One is complete and they are in the exhibition, and the others are all fragmentary. And then utensils for eating, vessels for drinking, book covers, combs for personal grooming, and this matches the type of material that is also in chest B, which is interesting. So you see a commonality between those two different chests with the same type of material, and pipes is the other thing I should have mentioned, although the person that packed chest A had 16 pipes in there, some of which were smoked and some of which were unsmoked, so they would have still had tobacco in them. So yeah, quite a lot of pipes, and what's possibly a tamper as well for those. So, but in addition, in chest A and exclusively to chest A, we also have sealing wax, ink, textiles, and wooden tool handles. So although only the handles have survived, the business ends have corroded away, the handle shapes are similar to gimlets or awls, and these are the kind of tools that you would use to make holes in, punch holes in leather, or make holes in a textile as well if you wanted to make an eyelet. So there is, yeah, I'm going to move on to the next one. So these are some of the objects that I've highlighted there as being connected to textiles. Obviously a stack of thimbles, and then we have the shoe last. Now this is a straight type shoe last, which means you could make it for either foot. It's a man's shoe, for shoe form, and this actually does match up with the other pair of men's shoes that are in the chest in terms of the size, so that they probably belonged to that individual, and it's something that they use to have their shoes made on. And then also we have this 4-collared bobbin. Now there are 2 of those in the chest, and that would give you 6 different types of thread or yarn all separated out. And then of course the cloth bale seal at the bottom, which indicates that this person is buying a bale of cloth or has received a bale of cloth. So these little tokens were attached around the edge of the textile, impressed into place, and you can still see the twill weave on the back of this bale seal as well. So the big story in this case was the leather pouch with the crowns on it, which indicates possibly that this person was a servant within the royal household. So I suppose the question from there is whether this indicates, this amount of textile tools indicates a professional interest in making, mending or maintaining clothing. Now, of course, we all want to know who owned these clothes, none more so than me. And perhaps as the research project progresses, we might find more details of passengers and more details as well of servants that might come to light, especially if more chests are actually found and recorded, then we'll be able to get more of a sense of what passengers were actually packing. But it would be fascinating to see some male clothing, because at the moment within that bundle there's nothing that we can identify as being male. Apart from all of the shoes outside the bundle. So for now, just looking at what we have, there have been several theories presented to me certainly, and the first, given the quality of the damask and given the quality of the silk, is whether or not these were actually gifts. And while there were some newly purchased goods in chest A, you have a stack of combs which are interleaved with wood, tied around with a braid. They look like they've just been bought. Actually, these are showing signs of wear, these objects. They have definitely been used, which Ninya will pick up in her part of the talk. The next possibility is that this is a passenger's clothing. There's no corroborated evidence of a woman being on board. Of course, women were on board naval ships, we know that. But the only reference is to an English lady drowning in the tragedy from one source. And if you were an English lady, would you be very happy to have your clothing at the bottom of a chest underneath 16 pipes and 4 pairs of men's shoes? I don't know. Another point to note here is the absence of a gown. There's no gown, there's no bodice, there's no shift. There's a kind of fundamental undergarment. So this isn't a full collection of clothing. Also, some of the knitted items, as I said, could be from upper garments. It doesn't give you one full set of clothing. And crucially, the petticoat here, the ties have been cut, and that's not worn away by the sea or anything like that. They have literally been cut at the same distance from each other here. So you wouldn't be able to just sort of pick this up straight away, get dressed in it and go on. And then they could have been transported on behalf of somebody else as well. That's another possibility. But one of the things that's really fascinating to me is the presence of all of these smaller pieces of textile within this bundle. So you've got 4 ties like this one up here. These are sections of silk that have been folded over and hemmed. They've been unpicked already. They have stitch marks in them, and there are 4 of them in there. Could they be there to actually attach onto the end of these ties? Possibly. And also the remnant. So this, rather dull-looking A4 piece of paper size bit of cloth is familiar to anybody who's done any dressmaking. You just keep that little bit that's left over from your project and it will come in handy one day. And so, but do you pack that with your clothing when you're going away somewhere? So all of these different kind of mitigating factors come into play to look at that. So this does give us another theory, and that's the possibility that this is a pile of clothing which is in the process of being adapted, mended, remade, possibly. So just moving on to the display within the exhibition, it was oh, thank you. So we wanted to display things as if they were shown in a lab or in a study space, encouraging people to look closely at them. But also laying out flat was a practical necessity for us because everything had to be flat for the condition of the objects. But this is a particular problem, especially with the hood, which completely loses any sense of its three-dimensionality when it's laid down like that. So this is when I turned to Ninya to come and make some replicas of the objects in order to help us interpret them.
Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's really lovely and exciting to be invited to contribute to this wonderful exhibition following the remarkable discovery. I just watched the video very briefly in the exhibition and actually only saw the exhibition very briefly. But I totally get what you two were saying, Julian and Lincoln, about when the news was finally released. The relief, I think I felt to a tiny extent that you must have done, that you didn't have to keep it a secret because it's such an exciting cache of finds. So you've heard the words reconstructions and replication. So I thought I should probably just begin by just briefly explaining the difference between those things, because what I normally do for most of my work is make reconstructions of period dress. But when you're making versions of period dress, there's kind of a hierarchy that you need to look at of interpreting. So you get recreation, you get reconstruction, and you get replication. So recreations of period dress usually involve some kind of element of imagination and fantasy. Reconstructions are when you're trying to make an accurate copy of period dress, but you have missing information, for example, if you're working from a portrait, and there's some degree of justifiable speculation in your reconstruction. What we're doing here is making a replica, or as far as possible, an exact copy of an extant object. We don't need to make things up because all the evidence is there. And that's quite a rare opportunity to actually get to do that. And in my limited time this evening, I just wanted to give you a quick insight into how I go about making a replica, working on an original. It's very challenging when the pieces are fragile, and as Ruth has just said, they need to be kept flat. So the first thing I do, and I always do when I look at an original piece, is to observe it as I leave the camera or the phone to one side and resist taking photographs, observe it, write all my observations down in my notebook, and I do drawings, and I'm not an artist at all, but I really encourage anyone that's trying to replicate something to draw what you're seeing, because it's only when you start drawing that you really notice all the details and ask the right questions about the object you're looking at. So the first process with this object, which I think at the time we called a collar, and now we're calling a gorget or possibly a whisk. It could be either of those things. The first thing I did was observe it, make the notes, take lots of measurements, do my drawings. But also the photograph on the right shows you how it's on its mounting board, and we weren't going to move it off of the mounting board in order for me to make a pattern, but I positioned pins all the way around the edge of the mounting board and at the relevant corners of the garment so that I could take measurements and transfer them over to dot and cross paper. This picture shows very clearly how on the area of the gorget that would sit on the shoulders, there are two almost kind of grease spots which are very suggestive of a person having worn this garment repeatedly and arranging it on their shoulders or possibly adjusting it when it slipped out of place. And it's one of the clues to the fact that this garment has been worn and is not a new item. Once I'd done my drawings and my observations, taken lots of measurements, when I was back in my studio in Nottingham, I transferred all of that information onto the dot and cross paper and made what's known as a toile, or a mock-up in calico, to test my theory of how it was made. And although at first glance the collar or gorget or whisk appears to be a very simple garment, it's actually quite a complex construction. The main part is cut on the bias with a very narrow hem around the neck, and then the whole edge is essentially bound with a very deep strip of silk cut on the straight grain and then shaped to go around the shoulders with pleats. And there's also darts in the main part of the collar across the shoulders. So that's what makes it sit really beautifully on the figure. Here are some of the detailed photographs I took when I was looking at the garment here in the museum. And you can see lots of information about the different stitches that we used. The top left-hand image is quite interesting because that's the underside of the front opening of the gorget. And the silk has just been turned back by about an inch, and the edge left completely raw, which is quite an interesting detail on what is otherwise a very beautifully made object. On the top right-hand side, you can see the underside of the pleats that go over the shoulder and how they've been held in place with kind of long stay stitches. Again, a very interesting detail. The bottom right-hand picture shows a detail of the binding that goes around the edge of the collar and how it has a tuck all the way around the edge, which somehow, when I first saw it, didn't strike me as very 17th century. Like the whole thing, to me, when I first looked at it, looked almost Victorian. But it's a lovely detail, and it's most definitely 17th century. These are pieces of braid, or lace as they would have been known at the time, a loose piece that was found in the bundle that matches the lace that's on the actual gorget itself. We didn't really notice, you don't notice easily when you're just looking at the thing with the naked eye, but under magnification you can see that there are two different types of lace which fasten the gorget. And one appears to have almost a plaited appearance and the other more of a woven appearance. And one of them is used for 2 of the 6 ties and the other for 4 of the 6 ties. So here's the replica, which you can see in the exhibition, or you may have seen already. And the laces that were replicated by a very talented modern-day silkwoman called Gina Barrett, who established that one of the braids was made with tablet weaving and the other with weaving, more traditional weaving on a tabletop loom. And then briefly the hood. This is a really exciting find. As Ruth has hinted, these are really quite everyday objects. They're not the sort of thing that ladies were painted in for their portraits. We see them in genre paintings and some sketches. So as far as I know, it's a unique survival, a hood made in silk of this type. It was quite a difficult thing to take a pattern from because it's very shaped when it's fully made. But the main way I was able to take the pattern is that I could establish that both the long front edge and the gathered shorter edge were the selve edge of the fabric. So it's made from a length of fabric about 56 inches long, so you know, very, very large piece of fabric, by the width of the fabric, which was 21.5 to 22 inches wide, which is completely standard for a period silk. It's interesting to speculate that it would be very easy to undo this hood and be left again with a useful length of fabric that you could do something else with, which is probably one of the reasons why silk hoods didn't survive to the present day. So you can see again my annotated drawings and comments on the construction of the hood, a detail of the original, and then on the lower right-hand side, the paper pattern for the hood laid out on my cutting table. And my cutting table is 6 feet wide, so you can see just how big that paper pattern is. And here are the reconstructions in the studio, and there's a real transformation from that very simple shape of the hood, the genius of the way that it's made, so that you just tie it in the front and it makes that very classic look that we see in the Holler engravings, for example. And it's interesting that, you know, on my replication, it's completely smooth because it's new, but on the example from the Gloucester, it's very creased, and particularly in the area where it would be gripped and bunched together and then tied under the chin. And also the silk in that area is really quite worn from those repeated tyings and handlings. So the process of making a replica and asking all those questions is so important to deepen our understanding of what these garments look like and how they were worn. And hopefully you can see in the exhibition it really does help bridge that gap from how the garments have ended up in their brown and bedraggled state to how they would have been when they were new. That was a bit of a whistle stop, so thank you very much, but we are taking questions.
Ladies, would you please come and join me, and we will invite questions from our online audience and from in the room, and there will be somebody that will go around with a microphone so that people online can hear what's being said in the room. We have a question with this gentleman. Just wait for the, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was very interesting. We're in Norwich here, which has a long tradition of textile making. So I wonder either whether there were any textiles relating to Norwich found on the Gloucester, or more generally, were there any Norwich textiles in the late Stuart courts that you spoke of so eloquently? Thank you.
So no, that's all of the textiles that have been recovered so far, and as indicated by that example in the Victoria and Albert Museum, I think it's probably continental silk. Not sure about the silk for the hoods and the gorget actually, but yeah, not related to Norwich, I'm afraid. I don't know if Norwich textiles appear in, but I suppose they're not, well, there aren't many surviving examples of Norwich textiles from that period, so they're not easy to spot.
No, but there are references. So in the accounts for the King's clothes, they list the fabrics that they're made from,
Yeah.
and they do identify some as definitely being domestically produced, and they indicate the regions that they're from.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that's very much what he's trying to do, is to encourage people to buy home-produced goods, in particular from places like Norwich. Absolutely.
Thank you. There's a question, the lady towards the front.
Thank you very much. Amazing stuff, fascinating. I'm sure lots more that you're looking forward to exploring. I just wanted to ask, following on from that question, what the other locally made or nationally made textiles would be. We've got the wool. I mean, although you said that there was a suggestion that linen and calico could actually still be imported, you know, when there was a discouragement to do this. What other fabrics would then have been available to people?
Well, there would have been a combination of wools of different sorts and from different places. So actually, there is a huge range of different terminologies for the wools. But there are also fabrics that combine fibres. So wool and silk, for instance, different types of animal fibre and silk. So in that sense, there are quite a broad range of these fabrics that would come under the category of those sort of new draperies. They're lighter and more flexible than the sort of traditional broadcloth. Less hard wearing in some respects, but not all. But of course, from the point of view of the manufacturer, that's desirable because you encourage people to buy them again, new colours, new options. So there are a broad range of woolen fabrics. Unfortunately, also, there are some that are being imported. So even though he's saying they should buy British produce, they don't always. There's a strong market coming in from the Netherlands.
Thank you. I think there's a question here, and then to that gentleman.
Hello, thank you. When you're dealing with fabrics of this sort of age, certainly from an academic position, is it always archaeological in that you're working with artifacts and remnants, or do you have historical documents to consult as well? Oh, and also a supplemental question, where did the silk come from?
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the silk, is similar to the one at the V&A that was woven in either France or Italy. So I think that is likely that it could be from there. But yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, I think the silk's most likely from France or Italy, although as you cover in your excellent book, Stuart Style, James the First did try to get a native silk industry going, didn't he? But I think it's pretty unlikely that it was native silk that was. But yes, in answer to your first question, when I'm making reconstructions, even with working from a complete extant example like that, I will always try and draw on the three main sources of information. So I will always try and draw something from documentary sources, something from visual sources, and then something from an extant or archaeological artifactual source. So in this instance, we're really lucky that we have all of the information really that we need in terms of how it looks and how the construction works. But it's still really important, as we've both found, to do the research on the visual clues to how they're worn and how they look. And then the documents, again, we keep referring to Pepys, but documents like Pepys's diary are just completely invaluable for getting the context. And again, he refers to his wife, he and his wife going to the exchange, and his wife buying a hood and a whisk and a scarf. And you need all of those elements to really build the whole picture.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to just pop in first with a little question, if I may, which is about money. We're talking at different extremes, really, or not necessarily extremes, but different levels of costume that were being talked about from the artefacts that have recovered from the Gloucester, and then the really top level. And obviously, I appreciate Pepys was borrowing his, renting his coat for his portrait. Do you have a sense of how much financially those different sorts of clothes would have costed at the time, and is it possible to show that kind of relationally to other items that people were buying at the time? Please.
So yes, I think in that sense, that's one of the things that's actually very interesting about Pepys, that he invariably complains that when his wife goes shopping, she spends more than he would have liked her to, and more than he's spent himself. And that's where he gets quite indignant. We definitely get a sense that, you know, as the head of the household, that he ought to be spending the most on his clothes, as his appearance is the most important for the domestic dynamic, as it were, and that he's very keen to present himself as a upwardly mobile individual attached to the royal household and, of course, to the navy. But yes, so Pepys is very helpful because he actually records the amount that they spend on the individual items, and then it's possible to compare those contemporary prices to the prices, for instance, that you get in the royal household accounts, and that's where we can see. So Charles is really interesting because we have a full set of accounts for his wardrobe for each year of his reign. And so you can literally chart how many suits he buys in a year, and you know how much fabric on average that a suit might require, what he's paying per yard for it. So you have a really good sense of those garments in their absolute detail, but it then allows you to map that onto, as Ninya was saying, you can look at someone like Pepys and other people who keep household accounts.
Yeah, so that other, the article I mentioned, going through the Duchess of Devonshire's accounts is really interesting because you're comparing that against the stock and inventories, and seeing that actually something like a hood, you could be looking at the same shape essentially, but made in different fabrics, and that's the kind of messaging around costume that you see quite a lot of people being able to read your level in society through which fabrics you're actually using.
And presumably you're having not necessarily new clothes.
Yeah. I mean, there is that element of second-hand and remaking, which I think is so fascinating, again, with sort of looking at something which is archaeological rather than something like that beautiful silver tissue gown, which has clearly been kept and preserved and held in as one piece, whereas this is giving us a slightly different slice, if you like, into one person's use and gathering together of textiles.
Thank you. And thank you so much for waiting so patiently. It's the gentleman.
On a practical level, how would they have cared for their garments? Presumably the cotton could have been washed regularly, and especially if it was undergarments, would have needed to be done. But in the case of wool and silk, would it just have been a case of gentle brushing? And
Yeah, yeah, and some kind of dry cleaning as well in the form of using, you know, paraffins and different alcohols to remove stains. I mean, I'm thinking more of a Victorian, but I'm sure the same thing went on. But a lot of it is brushing, and it is, as you say, keeping the outer layers away from the body with your linen undershift. To make sure you have that barrier there, but also I think it's interesting looking at the binding on the bottom of the petticoat. Now that is kind of worn in places and has lint in it. That's another area where actually if you just sort of took that off and then replaced it, you're actually making sure that you're extending the life of the damask by sacrificing, if you like, the binding and changing that out. So I think there was a lot of that kind of work, and that's why you had so many servants to actually help maintain this clothing. But it's interesting, even the shoes that are in the exhibition have a little kind of repair on one of the latchets there. So I think people were valuing and caring for them in that way.
It was described as a party ship in some of the earlier talks. Yet to come across any red wine stains.
Maybe that's the benefit of the tannins leaching out all the other.
I think we've got a question online. So do you want to give the microphone, please? Thank you.
The online comment says, thank you, interesting talks. I was wondering, have the shoes and petticoats given any indication of the size of the wearer?
So the waist measurement of the petticoat is around 22 inches. I think now I'm going to get my measurements mixed up here, but I can only remember the height is 80 centimetres, so it's not particularly tiny and not quite short, but the shoes are approximate to a size 1 of contemporary footwear, so that's how big. So and the two petticoats, I should have mentioned actually, they are the same waist measurement and the same height as well, so at least those two are definitely from one person.
Thank you. Helen, I think lady in the second row.
Thank you, that was really interesting. Was there anything about where this chest was sited that made it particularly good for conserving the textiles? And if so, are there other sites like that and prospects of more exciting textiles to come out of the Gloucester?
I'm just looking at you guys over there. Well, as I said, there's this area of kind of, it must have been in a silty conditions to be preserved. And then as this kind of, you know, you get the waves of sand moving over, that's when it became exposed. So I guess there's every likelihood that there's more there.
And there's lots of sand at the stern section, well over 3 metres, so we're pretty confident there's a lot more material trapped underneath the surface. And there's certainly over 25, 26 cannons still buried, and they would attract crates and chests. And so there's lots of potential. Because the ship sank so quickly, 45 minutes, they had no chance to take anything off. And the Tooke come off these underglows, so potentially all these clothes are still down there as well. So lots of fingers crossed.
Gentlemen's outfits.
That's what we want
I think
to
we've
see.
got a question halfway down on the other side for Dan.
Thank you very much. Great session. As maybe a question possibly for Claire and also for Maria. For Claire, I was wondering about inventories and possibly wills and other ways of tracking what was on there. I take it there was no system of insurance that would have itemized anything or that any claims that could be made afterwards. Maria, I was wondering about the question of reuse. Was such an interesting theme, I think, across the talks about reuse. Is there any evidence of reuse of royal garments in particular, which might have a particular value? But clearly, royal personages from your talk are buying rather a lot, and therefore a lot of leftovers. So thank you.
I'll start on the wills. Yes, there is wills that have been looked at as part of the project, but they're not really itemising individual things. You know, my second best bed in the sort of Shakespeare kind of tradition. What's interesting is that naval crew do, have registered their wills, but it's not indicating the kind of the textiles and in terms of insurance, again, not aware of that, but what is interesting is that James, because he obviously you know, this is such a tragic event. People sometimes, you know, read when he writes to Lawrence Hyde, who is the Lord Treasurer, because it's James Hyde, the second kind of officer on board that sadly dies, the brother of Lawrence Hyde, and James's brother-in-law, because his first wife was Anne Hyde. People often say that there's a sort of a coldness in the way in which James kind of talks about the death of his brother-in-law through that active service. But in another way, he does clearly feel concerned enough about the loss of life of, you know, so many of the crew and so many of his household. He does comment on that he gives pensions to the widows of the crew that died. There's obviously then a whole process about how that is done, and you know there's a lot of pleading of the belly to sort of, because you'll get more money, so it's interesting. So there's not insurance as such, but there is compensation. But that, of course, doesn't compensate for the loss of your major breadwinner in that period.
And with the king's clothes, there isn't a record of his outer garments being given away, for instance, as there are for some of the earlier monarchs like Henry VIII. However, Pepys does note that there is a period where Charles has no shirts. This is because the various officers of the bedchamber have claimed the last 6 months' worth of shirts as their perquisite, and they've just taken them. No new ones have arrived, partly because he's late paying the linen draper's bill, and there's an awful moment where the king is shirtless. And so that's an element of it. But also, there's a reference to him and his brother lending their clothes from the coronation to the 2 theatrical companies that they are the patrons for a particular production. And so, you know, those robes that we saw, the coronation robes and the garter suits, yes, those could have been seen on stage to really sort of make those royal characters in the plays look the part.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, with reference to sort of like the rarity of some of the textiles that have been found, how far were expectations met in what you might have found, and has that shaped what you think could be found in the future, maybe at the Gloucester or other sort of collections that could be discovered?
Well, I think the textile bundle was a bit of a surprise to come out, so I don't think there were expectations necessarily. So I should explain that the contents of the 2 chests were rescue archaeology because they were at risk of being lost. So it was a question of making sure that they weren't lost and came up. So there's no expectations necessarily. What I find really interesting and why other chests would be fascinating is to understand how passengers were packing their clothing, so that you can make more meaning perhaps out of the ones in chest A already. And where are all the male clothes, basically, all those shoes and no male clothes? But they are extremely rare examples, and as Ninya sort of pointed out, that's because they would have unpicked, been made into something else. And even that image of the cover from the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a piece of dress silk that has been reused for another purpose. We see that quite a lot in the 18th century material that we look after here. So I think that's the point at which it's very, very interesting, is because it gives us a slice of things that we don't normally see surviving. So what we could learn from other chests of the same preservation is absolutely staggering, really.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a lady with a question at the front in the second row.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the 2 pairs of shoes that are there, because there's one with some laces that look very, very different from the fancy pair that look like the V&A shoes, but the other ones look a little bit like slippers or maybe workday shoes or anything. Have you looked at those? Are they different, or am I just imagining that?
The ones that are in the case, so there is actually one single shoe, the female shoe, which is in kind of fine, and then the ones around about in the middle of the case, that's one pair of one of the 4 pairs of shoes that came out of chest A, and that's a man's pair of shoes, but what's interesting is contrasting them with the other pair which are in the chest B side, and those are narrower, the leather is finer, and the heel is higher on those. So we're sort of thinking that that actually indicates a slightly different kind of level in terms of status between the owner of, you know, chest A shoes and chest B shoes. But the ones from chest A, actually the ones that we have in there, they're the ones with the repair on them, or I think is a repair, where around the latchets which come and meet at the front, so there's 2 holes that you use to tie the shoes together, and one of the latchets has actually had another piece sewn onto it. So it looks like, you know, it's a very classic kind of thing that you would put a lace through and that hole would tear. So again, looking at somebody that's mending their clothes, and those are actually, interestingly, they're suede side out, essentially, they're softer side out, so they would look different, they're not as shiny as the other ones are. So yes, there is definitely, even within just those 2, you know, and 3 individual shoes and 2 chests, there is a real difference.
Francesca, question from Francesca.
I just had a quick question for Maria. As we know, Catherine of Braganza, she brought a hefty dowry in terms of territories, including Goa, is it? I believe the island of Goa being one of them. Did this make, because you were also mentioning the oriental silks used for fashionable dressing gowns like Lord and Lady Clapham. Did Catherine of Braganza's bringing of these dowries into the British realm, as it were, did that make the wearing of that kind of a foreign material more acceptable and fashionable than a European material would be?
That's a really good question. She's certainly, in addition, so in terms of some of the things that came in her dowry, and also things that were, say, coming on some of the Portuguese ships in association with some of the Jesuits that came, we see lots of really fancy Indian and Japanese furnishings, and those definitely appear in her apartments, and we also see them in the apartments of the Duchess of Portsmouth, who's one of Charles's sort of leading mistresses. So I think there's a real vogue for the sort of Eastern and exotic, both textiles, furnishings, clothing. Yes, so in part it is to do with Catherine, but also I think in part they are fashionable in their own right at that point, and she just adds to that. And you certainly see the East India Company, for instance, giving her gifts of these exotic items as well.
We could fit in one more, and there's a question at the back, so, and that I think will have to be our last question, and then it's wine time.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the actual process of extracting these wonderful items from the shipwreck. So I think one of the slides alluded to gradual desalination process. So were there any other steps taken to get these objects from under the sea to a more stable state? Thank you.
Textiles, I think, are one of the easier materials to work with in terms of this, because you don't need to necessarily replace. So with the wooden artifacts, and you actually need to help the cellular structure to stay whole when the water is removed, and you have other processes you need to deal with for other materials. But my understanding of this, and I'm not a maritime archaeologist, is that what has happened is essentially you keep them in fresh water, you keep on changing the water until you carry on checking the salinity. Once the salinity indicates that there's no salt in there, that means they're desalinated, and until they're actually then treated, they can be kept in fresh water. From when they went up to York Archaeological Trust, I think they were just unwrapped, and then they would have been slightly rinsed, I'm sure, and then laid out to dry, and that's the bit then you need to sort of make sure that they are drying nice and flat. But I think it's less involved in terms of the chemical processes you need to do to replace structure within textiles, and they are remarkably preserved. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add. No?
Well, the fridges were handy.
Yeah, fridges.
The temperature about 80. dark, I would say from month to month, we just change the water and just change the water, kept an eye on it, kept it really still, and it wasn't until the conservators came down to our lab and they unwrapped the bundle that we actually knew there was something in it. So it was a lovely surprise to see that. So yeah, the main thing is keep it in the dark, keep it temperature stable, just copy the anaerobic conditions on the seabed best you can.
And on that note, can I thank our online audience for being here, for you in the room, and can we, in the traditional way, thank our magnificent speakers.